Welcome back to the KOBN podcast, the podcast where we reconnect, reminisce, and celebrate the unique journeys of our Old Boy network. I'm David Flores, and today we dive into the second episode of our special series, How the Hell Did You End Up at Kemper? In this series, we explore the stories of how our fellow Old Boys found their way to Kemper Military School and College. So, before we get into today's guest story, I want to introduce a new segment to the podcast. This segment is called Unlocking the Vault, Fascinating Tales from Kemper Military School's Storied History. Today's fascinating tale is about the 1987 tragedies at Kemper Military School. This segment covers the tragic and shocking events that rattled the institution and its community to the core. The murders that took place early in February 1987. From a story in the Chicago Tribune dated February 11th, 1987, in early February 1987, the students and faculty of Kemper Military School, the oldest military school west of the Mississippi River, were shaken by the murders of two cadets in separate incidents over the span of just 3 days. This double tragedy deeply impacted the tight-knit community at the 143-year-old institution near the Missouri River, about 100 miles east of Kansas City. The first incident occurred on February 2nd, when the body of 17-year-old cadet Brandon Gouchard was found by police in Lincoln, Nebraska. Brandon had been shot to death alongside his brother, sister, and parents. According to police, Brandon's father, deeply in debt, murdered his family on January 30th, then drove to Columbia, Missouri to pick up Brandon, who was visiting there. He then drove Brandon back to the family home and killed him before taking his own life. Brandon was set to be honored as the outstanding young cadet at Kemper on February 6th. As the school prepared for a memorial service for Brandon on February 4th, another tragedy struck. Jane C. Ray, a 19-year-old cadet from Charleston, West Virginia, had been reported missing on February 1st. Her body was discovered in a wooded area on the Kemper campus just hours before services for Brandon were to begin. She had been beaten to death. On February 5th, 19-year-old cadet Mark E. Johnson, Jane's boyfriend from Denver, was arrested and charged with her murder. The deaths of Brandon and Jane and the subsequent charges against a fellow cadet left the Kemper community in shock. Roger Harms, the president of Kemper and a retired Army colonel, canceled the memorial service for Brandon, opting instead to let cadets remember their classmate in their own personal ways. Harms expressed hope that these tragedies would bring the cadet family closer together, emphasizing the importance of resilience and character in facing such challenges. The impact on the cadets was profound. Many struggled to cope with the loss and the reality that such violence had touched their lives so closely. One cadet reflected on the difficulty in maintaining motivation and the demoralizing effect of the incidents. Despite the school's efforts to support its students, the sense of security and normalcy was deeply shaken. This tragic episode in Kemper's history is a somber reminder of the fragility of life and the unpredictability of human behavior. It underscores the importance of community and support during times of crisis. While the murders of Brandon Gouchard and Jane Ray remain a dark chapter, the response of the Kemper community highlighted its resilience and capacity for healing. It's time to move on to Phil's story. In our last episode, we introduced the idea behind the series and shared some of the reasons why we're excited to hear your stories. Today, we're kicking things off with a fellow Old Boy that was at Kemper with me from 1991 to 1993. Our guest nearly missed the chance to become part of our community, but fate had other plans. I'm thrilled to introduce our guest today, Phil Viehmann. Phil graduated in 1984, and his journey to our school is both fascinating and inspiring. Welcome to the show, Phil.
Hey, David. How I ended up at Kemper was I I'd gotten letters for the recruitment letters, just like all the other colleges, but I had no desire to go to a military school at that time. I was supposed to go to the University of Tennessee, and that didn't pan out. So Tennessee sent me to Fort Scott in Fort Scott, Kansas. Well, it wasn't until after I was there that I found out that Kemper played Fort Scott. Well, my childhood buddy growing up, Mark Gwynn, they all called him Earthquake, he had gone to Fort Kemper, and so we figured we could see each other at least once a year that way. But I wasn't getting along with the offensive line coach. I wasn't happy. So anytime we had time off, instead of going home, which was about a 4-hour drive, it was only 2.5 roughly, I would drive up, and a couple of times I'd spent the night at Kemper visiting with him and a couple of other guys that I knew that were there. So I actually kind of knew some more about Kemper just from those guys like that. But when Kemper showed up to play Fort Scott down there, Mark had forgot his shoes, so he borrowed mine. So I ran to the locker room, came back, and when I came back with the shoes, that's when he introduced me to Coach Cluck. By December, at the end of the semester, I was done with Fort Scott. Just wasn't happy with the offensive coaches. So I dropped out. We got in the workforce, and then I was talking to Mark, talked to Jim Ray a little bit, and he said I had to stay out that whole semester. And then I had to wait, I want to say it was like July before I could make up my mind to go back, and that was enough time allotted that I didn't have to sit out another semester from football. He was able to sign me to play ball there, and that's what we did. Just waited everything out, and on my side, and of course Kemper played Fort Scott, so that was a big plus for me because I wanted to possibly get even with them on the scoreboard and just physically beat the crap out of their team, just because I didn't think Kansas players were really crap back then. So that's how I ended up at Kemper. Just the way things worked out, and it worked out in my benefit, I guess, to go there. I got a good education from Kemper, so no regrets. Glad to be an Old Boy.
Thanks so much for coming on the show, Phil, and sharing your story. I do want to add a little bit of color to Phil's story here. Going back to what he said about putting a beating on Fort Scott. Well, Phil had a real unusual pregame ritual against Fort Scott. During the pregame warm-ups, Phil was off to the side by the field goal post, and he was like pacing back and forth, slapping his helmet and grumbling vulgarities. And then he took his shoulder to the goalpost a few times and made it sway back and forth as he hyped himself up to bring the smackdown onto some Fort Scott defensive linemen and linebackers. So anyway, when he made his way back to the team, he'd worked himself all up and he was breathing hard and sweating, and he was still all jacked up and in a frenzy. He took off his helmet to cool off. And that's when he was approached by Old Boy Devin Benton, who cranked up the hype by asking Phil in his pregame voice if he was ready to bring the smackdown on to Fort Scott. Well, Phil got so cranked up as they started exchanging shoulder pad smashes, with their hands. And then Phil, out of nowhere, he wasn't wearing his helmet anymore, goes and gives a huge headbutt to Devin, who still had his helmet on. Well, needless to say, Phil gashed open his forehead and blood just gushed down his sweaty face. Man, talk about intimidating. I would have hated to be a defensive lineman looking at Phil on the opening drive. Talk about a rabid dog, man. It didn't get any better than that. Great memories, Phil. Thanks for bringing it back then and for bringing it today. Well, that does it for this episode of the series. Thank you for joining us today on the KOBN podcast. Thanks to everyone who has reached out to share their story. I can't wait to get those episodes out into everybody's ears. If you want to share your story, hit me up. It's a simple process. All you have to do is record yourself telling your story on a smartphone and send it to me send me the video through Messenger or some way, and I'll do the rest. If you enjoyed this episode, Please subscribe, rate, and review it on your favorite podcast platform. And don't forget to share it with fellow alumni who might have a story to tell. I'm your host, David Flores, and this has been the KOBN podcast. Until next time, keep sharing your journey, stay connected, stay inspired, and remember, every path to Kemper is worth celebrating.